Welcome to this joint webinar between Association for NLP and APM, People Specific Interest Group. We want to hear from you, and therefore we also have audience polling. This is occurring now at the beginning and then again later on. I'm already on Menti and answering. Thank you very much, and it's building very fast. That's a very strong winner at the moment. By far and away, the majority are a project or program manager who coordinate and manage the work.
Welcome to everybody who's joined today. In a moment, we're going to be meeting our panel, and we'll then look at how practical and realistic outcomes are delivered in a large infrastructure project. After that, we'll be sharing a standard model that's used to create effective outcomes. And we'll then look at how elements of that framework are used in practice in a senior and team level scenario. And then we want to hear from you about your experience of outcomes in the workplace. So today is about outcomes. We want to know what we mean by a well-formed outcome. So just before we meet the panel, let's understand what we mean. Dictionaries will define outcome as something that follows as a consequence of something else, usually an event or process. It's not necessarily the same as a goal. We usually want to achieve our goals, but outcomes are not always expected, positive, or desired. Neurolinguistic programming, which the ANLP is the kind of guardian of in the UK, clarifies this by referring to it as a desired outcome. And the APM body of knowledge defines outcome as the changed circumstances or behavior that results from the use of an output and leads to realization of benefits. So we'll go with this consensus that outcome means something that we actually want to happen and that delivers the benefits. So let's now introduce our panel. Pictures are on your screens now. Our panel today consists of Kim Kapur and Michael Dunlop. We'll be speaking to them in more detail shortly, although Kim does have to leave a little early due to a critical meeting. We also have a few technical issues with Kim's camera, by the way. So we had some pictures of her here and there in the presentation, but I don't think we'll be able to get her camera working unless miracles happen. Anyway, we know a little bit more about you in our audience now, because round about 2% or so are working in the sponsor or client area. So in a strong sense, the outcomes are being delivered for you. The very big majority of you are working in the program or project manager space, so you direct and manage the work that makes the outcomes happen. And a significant amount of people are working in contractors or specialist areas. You actually deliver the outcome on behalf of the sponsor and the project manager. So in a way, you are right in the front line of how achievable an outcome actually is. Okay, so we've got a large proportion of people, not surprisingly, in the project management sort of phase. Okay, so I'd like to now introduce our first panel expert today. That's Kim Kapur. I'm delighted to welcome her to our webinar. Kim is the station's client director for High Speed 2, which, as most of us know, is the new high-speed railway line that will run between the northwest and southeast of England, stopping at Manchester, Birmingham, and London. Phase 1 of this program is due to start running trains in around 2029. Kim is in charge of delivering 3 of the Phase 1 stations. I should add that I recently had the privilege of working with Kim on the Crossrail program, so I knew that if we wanted to find out how program managers and project managers deal with large and complex outcomes, she was definitely one of the people that we needed to talk to. So Kim, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks, Tim.
So we live in a world, Kim, where our world of work is increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I wondered if you'd be able to tell us a bit about how you make sure that your sponsors' expected outcomes are clear and well understood by everybody in the project team?
Yeah, I mean, with a program as big as Crossrail, you can sort of imagine, the outcomes were very publicly known. We were going to deliver an east-west railway end to end. It was going to come through central London. It was going to have a number of stations. It was going to provide step-free access. So it's very well known what the outcomes are going to be, and therefore what the benefits are going to be. But it's, you have to somehow turn that into tangible deliverables for the people that are actually working in the various parts of this mega program. So you have to start with the big picture. What does it mean to you? And then you have to sort of work out what's your role in this, because there's so many different roles, all driving for the delivery, but all having slightly different approaches because they come at it from a different direction or a point of view, if you like. So you need to know what you're there to do, and then use that to sort of build the sort of tangible outputs that you need to deliver. And they change, they change. The outcome doesn't change because you're still delivering this end-to-end railway and it's still got to provide, 24 trains per hour and all the usual. But actually, along the way, things happen, things change, and you have to adapt. But you can't take your eye off what you're there to ultimately achieve as the outcome. So, you work backwards, you try and understand, sort of taking backward steps, if you like, from what does this outcome mean to me? What's my part to play in this big picture? And then you sort of say, well, okay, what do I need to achieve that? And as you work that out, you can sort of start seeing what those sort of tangible deliverables are, and they then become the things that those people are accountable for delivering. And there will always be interfaces, but you recognise those as you go through that sort of a process. But it's really important that, you bring all the different functions together to come up with what that is, because it's not just a one team. There are engineers and operators and maintainers and all sorts, finance and commercial, all involved in those conversations, and it's all intertwined. So, we use things like route mapping and trackers and checklists and work breakdown structures and plans, all coming together in a project execution plan. And then you keep checking it and you keep adapting it as things change on a program, as things do. So, you make them tangible.
I was going to ask then about, because clearly, I mean, you've described very clearly there, Kim, how you kind of work with smaller groups to make sure that the bigger overall outcome stays on track. And I suppose, would it be fair to say that the programs that you've typically been involved with, and the one you're involved with now, HS2, there is quite a large team. So there's a lot of different groups to consider there.
Yes, and there's always it's a multiple sort of multifunctional job. Delivering stations, for example, regardless of whether it's on HS2 or Crossrail or TfL or anywhere, that role involves bringing together different functions to deliver an ultimate outcome that everybody has a part to play in. Yes, what you see might be, an operator opening a station, but that there's a lot more that goes on, to support that happening. You've got the maintainers and you've got the people that are actually doing the technical design and the delivery of the physical work, the contractor. It all has to come together and culminate in being able to achieve that final outcome. So, yeah, it's definitely multifunctional and involves all sorts of different functions.
Okay, just moving on to, again, large projects such as the ones that you work in, tend to have a lot of subcontracts and possibly a lot of subcontractors and specialist teams. So I wondered what your experience was of ensuring that a contractor or maybe an arm's length team is really owning the solution and feels part of the bigger team, rather than just getting too contractual about individual outputs or deliverables.
Yeah, that's often quite challenging actually on a lot of programs. But you have to have this approach of owning the whole. This is something that we learned only after, we had the issues with the programme on Crossrail in 2018, but really understanding what the whole culminates in, which includes the supply chain. They're part of the whole as well. So with that, having a common objective that are outcome driven as well. So it's not just a case of, I'm going to deliver this. It's, I'm going to deliver this to ensure this outcome. And there are people in a chain, if you like. You've got to understand that it's not just one side. You can't just be doing your own little thing and then not look at what the next person's got to do, and that actually you didn't quite do something here, so that person can't move on. You've got to own the whole. It affects you as much as it affects the other. So because you can't deliver the objective that you're there to do, and I think creating integrated delivery teams is really important. And it avoids getting into that sort of very commercial conversation. Now, of course, the supplier relationships are a commercial relationship, but I think, from my experience, at least 70% of it is behaviours and how you approach the conversations with them, fostering that sort of good collaborative working, being open and honest and transparent. Because yes, we accept, contractors need to make money, but we need the outcome. That's the kind of difference. We need them to do the delivery. They need us to pay them. If we accept that and we can work forward on that basis, then I don't understand why it couldn't be a win-win solution. I know it's not that easy, and I'm sure there's, a lot of people that are on this call that are going, if only it was that easy, and it isn't. But I do think that one team approach is really important. It really does help with getting teams to work together and come up with solutions. I think that actions definitely speak louder than words in this space. You have to demonstrate that you're owning the problem together, and that you're sort of helping the contractors as much as they're helping you. So because we know we need whatever it is that they're delivering, if they're failing, we're failing, aren't we? Because we're not getting our outcome. So why wouldn't you roll your sleeves up and help? Because it in turn helps you. Why would you watch them fail? Why would you watch a car crash happening in slow motion, as I often say? You would try and stop it, wouldn't you? Because the result of that affects you ultimately. So, that's kind of that one team working together, helping each other out, understanding they have a position, we have a position, and, like it or not, that is it, supplier, contractor, that's the way it works.
And I think you've just very eloquently described there, Kim, how you approach it, which is, if it all fails, if it fails, we all fail, which is, pretty clear. I suppose around about maybe 20 or so of our audience today say that they're part of the sort of contractor space or specialist contracts. And so it'd be interesting to know if use the questions feature of your system if anyone has worked in an integrated team and would like to just share their thoughts about that. And if we have time, we'll discuss that with Kim. Just moving on while we wait for that, Kim. One of the well-formed criteria that we'll be discussing later on in this webinar involves knowing when you've actually achieved a goal. Now, that might sound like a simple question, but are there any things to look out for here to know when you've actually got there?
Yeah, I think, at a tactical level, let's just start, going back to what I was saying originally about understanding your role, understanding, therefore, you do the mapping, you work backwards, you understand what you're actually there to deliver tangibly, gives you a good basis to start building, therefore, a bit of a timeline. We used a T-minus approach. You map it and people's roles and what the outcomes are expected at every point in the T-minus process would be sort of reviewed on a weekly basis, and you sort of do a go, no go position and a hold point. That's at a more tactical level. You have to have measurable deliverables and performance outputs at every step of the way as well. So that you're heading in the right direction. And knowing that you're actually getting that output functionality people get the opportunity to speak up, and you have to listen. And that's really important. But you know, when you're sort of trying to sort of work out whether you've achieved that success, well, you know, it's you go back to your overall objective, don't you? I'm here to, you know, in my case, I was there to open a station, and there was no point in opening that station if I didn't deliver the customer benefit. Now, there is a difference between opening a station and delivering the customer benefit. I was there to deliver the customer benefit overall, and the means to the end was delivering that station. So to me, there was no point in saying, I've done my job, I've opened a station, because if I couldn't sustain keeping that station open for a period of time and keep running that facility for the customers who are at the heart of everything, well, what's the point? You deliver the station, but it doesn't add any value, does it? So it's quite important that you keep that in mind, that customer, the outcome, and making sure that, you know, you're complying with all your requirements and your standards, and making sure those deliverables are tangible, and sort of always checking that you're still delivering the reliability, the availability, and all the rest of it that gives you that ultimate outcome, not just the immediate physical station, if you like.
Yeah, that sort of brings it right back to the start again, because you started out by saying you kind of work from the end forwards, and the end, of course, is the benefit that you've delivered. In this case, a station. Can people use it? Do they like to use it? Does it support the rest of the railway? In your case, but that's true in any program, I suppose, isn't it? To make sure that you've always got an eye on the end game.
Yeah, you do, and I think it's really important, you know, certainly from my point of view, that, you know, I had a mission statement. I had a mission statement for my team that encompassed every part of what we were here to do collectively. This is bringing all the functions back together. And the mission didn't change. We set this mission over 8 years before we actually opened the railway, and it still was true on the day we opened the railway. So to me, it's something that you kind of make all encompassing, but actually what it does is it gets everybody behind, you know, that mission. We're here to deliver this. But you know, sort of what goes hand in glove with that is your strategic objective and therefore your strategic risks. And when you sort of take the two and you sort of say, well, you know, you do what I would have done, you know, weekly sort of updates on where are we, what's going on kind of thing, then you do your risks and issues reviews, which, you know, most project managers would. You realise that, you know, if somebody's working on a particular thing, let's say, well, what risk is that related to? What risk are you mitigating when you do that? And if you can answer it, and I can see, yep, it's that risk because that risk is there to support that objective, do you know what I mean? It's kind of, okay, you're doing the right thing. But if you can't explain why you're doing what you're doing and what benefit it adds to the overall objective that we're here to deliver, take you back to the mission statement, then you've got to ask yourself why you're doing it. And it keeps people focused. Now, that doesn't mean to say that what they're doing isn't needed, but it may not be immediately needed for the purpose that we're here to do. You know, when you're up against it and you've got 101 things to do, a tight schedule, and, you know, you've got the world media watching you, as we did on the Elizabeth line, you have to make those sort of pragmatic and practical decisions. And that's kind of where we sort of got to in that level of detail is really being focused on, is it adding any value? Does it mitigate a risk? Is it supporting that objective? If it's not, don't do it.
Kim, thank you. That's I know you've got to run because you have to go to a critical meeting, but thank you very much for your input today. We were hoping to get a view from contractors who were in the call about working in an integrated team. Nothing really came in on those lines. But again, thank you, Kim, for your input today. Good luck with HS2 and your 3 stations, and thank you for joining us. So,
thank you.
Anyway, so we'll now move on to the next section of this webinar, and that is something which I'm going to tell you about now, which is a standard model that's used to build a well-formed outcome. This diagram on your screen is a coherent framework of conditions that we might apply to any outcome in order to check that it, as you might say, hangs together well. So this model is always based on everyone's understanding and experience of the outcome. You never just create it from nothing. You have to work with people who are in the program to get to this. And I should say that this model may not always apply to your area of work, which is fine, but you can use the bits that help you because, like any good framework, it's scalable. So if you look at the diagram on your screen, it shows the characteristics that a well-formed outcome should have. And each part supports all the other parts. So we'll look at each part in more detail in a second. So the first of these conditions that you see on your diagram here is that your outcome really should be stated in the positive. So in order to be clear about how you want to change from your present state, what you've got now, you need to state your desired alternative in the positive, because it's easier for our brains to move us towards what we want rather than away from what we don't want. And that's just the way our brains are wired. I mean, I'll give you an example. Okay, so if all the people in the audience now, 300 and odd people, I want you to imagine a hedgehog. Sound daft, just imagine the little creature, a little spiky creature. Imagine the word, imagine a cartoon hedgehog. So if everybody's thinking about a hedgehog, great. That's got to be a webinar record, by the way. But now I want you to stop thinking about hedgehogs. Banish it from your mind. Don't even think about the word. Okay, is anyone still thinking about hedgehogs? You probably are. That's because our brains find it more easy to latch onto something positive than to negate something. So, for example, if our outcome, and I'm going to take a really sort of current example, if our outcome was we will ban sales of new diesel and petrol cars from 2030, it's a negative. If instead we said we will ensure that people increasingly want to buy affordable electric cars between now and 2030 and charging infrastructure will be in place, I know it's longer, but it's stated in the positive. So switching from the negative to the positive will always help. This is something that's universal, this use of positive language. It applies to all of us, whether we're sponsor, client, project manager, or contractor. And the other benefit from stating it in the positive is that it allows us to use positive time-based steps to what we have to do in order to get to our outcome. The second condition is that the outcome is owned and desired by you. You and your team must really want it and play an active part in getting it. The outcome must be reasonably within your control. So it's something you have to do. So whether you're the sponsor or the client, if you're a sponsor or client, it's pretty a guarantee that you already know what you want as the outcome, because in projects, that's how it tends to work. But for the project manager and your team, is it really worth checking that everybody is 100% on board delivering that, and it stays that way? Probably is. Obviously, as Kim pointed out, dissenting voices got to be listened to, but it's your job to keep everybody on side so that everybody wants that outcome. If you're a contractor, then how much are you committed to delivering what the project team needs? And there's been a couple of questions on that in the questions, which I haven't read out, but generally along those lines. But if you can consistently show as a contractor that your team is enthusiastic about doing a really great job, like Kim was saying, integrated teams, then you'll probably do it. And I dare say you'll probably increase your chances of being hired again by showing that enthusiasm. If everyone wants the outcome, we're much more likely to get it. The next condition of a well-formed outcome is that it's stated specifically. Specifically state what you want. It always helps. We should try and take care that the language being used to describe the outcome is as clean and non-aspirational or delusional as possible. There's really no place for language like world-class this or market-leading that in a well-formed outcome. It doesn't really mean anything. Obviously, if there are clear sponsors requirements or contract conditions, that makes life a little bit easier for you. But in the previous example I gave of the electric cars, there are some specifically stated outcome parts. One, ensuring that people increasingly want to buy electric cars. Two, that they're affordable. And lastly, that between now and 2030, a suitable infrastructure for charging is in place. So there's nothing to stop you from being very specific in an outcome. There's nothing to stop you from encouraging your team to envisage what it would be like to have that outcome, by the way. That's something which is increasingly used in sophisticated organizations, doing a rehearsal for when you get it. You might even do a pre-mortem, which is what they call, finding out what happens when it all goes wrong, because that will identify what factors could stop you getting the outcome. So thinking about the specific outputs is very important. Moving on to the next condition, clear evidence. Having taken the trouble to define your outcome as specifically as possible, you need to be able to check evidence for delivery for each part and for the whole thing. So going back to my example, you could say, what would be evidence for our outcome? Well, a measure of the number of people buying electric cars would be something to measure. Research that tells you what figure people think is affordable. The quantity of charges that are available across the country. These are things you can actually say, and when we've got that, we're 70% there. Like Kim was saying, T-minus measurements are really good in this sort of area. But not all outcomes do have concrete deliverables that you can easily measure. So what evidence is going to tell you that you've achieved an outcome like that? Well, we'll be discussing this with Michael shortly. But anyway, a well-formed outcome frame helps you to create a project plan. And this is also true for sprints, by the way. If your project uses an agile model, sprints should be well-formed too. Okay, they also need evidence of achievement. So the next condition is resourced and sustainable. Your outcome needs to have resources that will deliver it. It can be tricky because, as we all know, it's rare to get all the resources you need in all of the time. In my example, what would happen if we can't install enough electric chargers, for example, by 2030? Resource shortages can be a significant issue where an organization uses matrix management and you have to bid for resource teams. But also on large projects, such as the ones that Kim and I have worked on, resource attrition can be an issue when people drift off towards the end, which can affect contractors and project teams just the same. And what about the delivered outcome? What if the design changes in the early stages mean that in order to achieve the sponsor's benefits, it needs a permanent army of technicians or a long-term support contract? Is that sustainable? So these are questions that you need to apply to your thinking for your outcome. The next outcome, fairly easy for us in projects. If the outcome is too big, it might need splitting, and the size of the chunks that you get have to be considered. Also, watch out that other conditions aren't violated when you split your project into different areas. Are you sharing resources across them? You might be. And also, is evidence being used in two places at once? That's very important, keeping the evidence clean. And the last condition for the well-formed outcome model is that it is ecological. And what do I mean by that? Well, that means that you need to consider who or what else might be affected by this outcome. So you need to check wider impacts. Will the outcome jeopardize positive aspects of the current state? So in my example, when we've electrified the country's cars, will that mean that an awful lot of small garages go out of business because they can't sell petrol and diesel anymore? That's an outcome that you didn't expect. Could the outcome that we deliver steal resources from other areas? I mentioned an army of clipboard people and technicians and so on. So think about that. And also, does the outcome support the organization's values and mission? Kim touched on that the mission of what we're doing is obviously the bigger thing of all. And does this outcome support that? It's very, very important that we all understand that. Otherwise, it's not coherent for the outcome to live in that mission. So it's not quite the same thing as thinking about risk management. Risk management is about whether there are things that are going to jeopardize our outcome itself. That's slightly different. Ecology, in this context, is more to do with whether our outcome is jeopardizing something else. Okay, the ecology of our outcome in the domain. So, for example, should we do change readiness assessments to check the likely impacts on other areas of our organization? Will everybody understand the outcome, or do we need extra training? These are things that need to be considered outside of the outcome itself. Normally, you'd try and build those into the outcome, I think, in a good program. So really, that's the model in its entirety. You can see it on the screen there again. It's sometimes called the posers model because as you go around the clock face, it generally reads out POSERS with an E on the end. So it's called the posers model. It's been developed from a framework with two people in the forefront, and that's Joseph O'Connor and John Seymour. It's in this book, and I put a reference to it on the screen there. It's a very practical, scalable framework that you can use. There's a lot more to it, by the way. There's only so much we can cover in an hour. But don't think that this model is something you only do at the start. I'd recommend quick checks throughout your program to make sure your outcomes stay well formed. And it's very good to do if you detect any mission creep. As I said, it's scalable, you can pick and mix, but the more of these conditions that you can apply to your outcome, the more likelihood you have of actually achieving it. And at the other end of the scale, if you really can't apply any of them, it's pretty unlikely you're going to achieve your outcome at all, I would say. But even that can be useful if you need to check up front whether you're doing the right project or program, or at least aiming for realistic outcomes. You might have to have some rethinking about that. So that's the well-formedness conditions model. It's an NLP title. I don't think it's a great name for it, to be honest. We just call it the well-formed outcome framework. But anyway, so that's it. It'll be in the material that you can see online later. Now it's time for me to have a quick glass of water, and then move to our next panel expert, and that is Michael Dunlop. Michael, if you can liven up your camera. Good, there you go. This is Michael Dunlop. Michael, hi. Michael is the Chief Executive of Power of Choice Limited. It's based in Northern Ireland, which is where he joins us from today. His work involves implementing far-reaching changes in some of Northern Ireland's most recognisable organisations in the public, private, community and voluntary sectors. Michael is a visiting lecturer at Ulster University Business School and is an international ambassador and a special envoy for government for the ANLP. So Michael, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Tim.
I wanted to just to sort of launch into your area. So one of your areas of expertise is in supporting senior public service leaders to deal effectively with the realities and challenges of systems that are sometimes more resistant to change. So the outcome is tricky to start with. Can you explain briefly how you deploy sort of well-formed outcome thinking in that scenario?
Yeah, sure. It's a lot of our work is in the public sector, and it's obviously complex. I'm also very conscious of our audience, and this is where I'm a little bit of a fraud. And what I mean by that is I'm conscious that the people who are in the audience actually have to deliver things, whereas we have the easiest job in the world. We work in particular with the likes of the Chief Executives Forum in Northern Ireland, who represent senior leaders across public service. And one of the programs that we deliver is quite well known. It's called the Transformative Leader. And it's about exactly what you've just talked about, is about delivering projects and transforming public services in a public service that is notoriously difficult to change for lots of different reasons. And one of the things we say at the very start of the program is, we couldn't do your job. And I'm going to say the same thing to your audience. The world is full of people who have never done the thing, telling other people how they should be doing it. And we never want our programs to be that. And it's the same thing with what we're about to talk about too. What we do in the program is share things that other senior leaders have found really, really useful. It was originally developed during the pandemic. So you can imagine the kind of challenges that senior leaders were facing. And consistently since then, one of the most important, impactful and useful practical tools that senior leaders come back to us again and again saying that they've used and they've employed is the well-formed outcome. And on a number of different levels. I wonder, would you mind sharing the questions? And I'll take everyone through the particular set of questions that we use. You just mentioned John Seymour and Joseph O'Connor, and this set of questions was developed by John Seymour. And it's really useful and very practical. And it's useful on a number of different ways whenever you're dealing with change and transformation, especially in public sector systems that are difficult and notoriously difficult to change. It starts with the first question, and that's actually defining the issue, and that's really, really important. So it starts with, how is this a problem for me? Or how is this a problem for you? Or how is this a problem for us? And it really helps to write it down. And what you're looking for is to get to the heart of the issue. So before you start thinking about what your outcome might be, what's the problem? And in general, with human beings, the heart of the issue will be something, some experience, something that's happening, some people, whatever it would be, is causing an experience we don't want. So the first question is, how is this a problem for you? And that's really, really important. And it's a step we often miss, especially in large scale projects. Because if we don't stop and think about, how is this actually a problem? You can end up jumping to an outcome. So for example, if it's difficult to get through to your local GP, rolling out new phone lines across GPs across the UK might be a project, and it might be an outcome, and it might seem like a good thing in the short term. But what it often means is that actually the poor receptionist who's in the GPs, who already can't answer the 5 phone lines that are already there, has another 3 phone lines which he or she now cannot answer. So stopping to ask, how is this a problem for us, before you come to the outcome, is really important. What would you rather have? And that's exactly as you've described it. That's the outcome you're aiming for. And that's the direction of travel you want to go in. Those 2 questions are really, really important. For yourself, defining how it's a problem and what would you rather have, but also in terms of motivation. And you mentioned it, Tim, earlier. It's a very crude thing in psychology, but it's also universally true mostly, that the way we often motivate ourselves is it's pain and pleasure. It's the old chestnut that if I have a headache, you can feel sympathy, but you're not particularly motivated to do something about it. When it's your head, it's sore, and you're more likely to take action. So finding out where the pain is helpful. And then having an outcome, having something you can move towards. That's what gets you to go and actually do something to change things. The next question then is, if you could have it, would you take it? And you mentioned about ecology. This question, I have to say, does an awful lot of heavy lifting in this model. And there's a reason for that. When you define the problem and you define the outcome, you then ask, right, if you could have that right now, would you take it? And what you're looking for are the yes buts. And that's where the impact of having the outcome will be. That's thinking about the impact it might have if you achieve it. As you mentioned, we can change everything to electric cars. What will it do to garages? What will it do to the various stakeholders who are involved? What will the impact or the consequences be? Yes, but we don't have the resources to do this. Yes, but whatever it might be. Or, well, yeah, which isn't a particularly motivating outcome and is less likely to happen. So you're looking for the yes buts when you ask yourself that question, because that allows you to refine the outcome and make it better, make it much more likely to happen, or to encompass all the various aspects that the outcome's going to affect. The last 3 questions then are really about making it real. So once you've set your outcome, where and when do you want it? And I realize I'm talking to the Association of Project Management, so this is something you're all very good at, but setting a deadline, absolutely nailing it down to a date and when it needs to be done. There's a trick with the human brain in that if you set a deadline, and usually when we're working with people, with organizations, with teams, we're looking at, oh God, because we want that bit where you've set a date and this needs to be done by, because then your brain starts to create the pathway, right? This is what we'll need to do, and we'll need to think about this, and this is how we'll have to do it. By the end of the year is not a deadline. That's a very vague thing, and lots of other pressures and things will come in, and it's highly likely to slide. Sometime next month, sometime by 2027, or we'll have it done in 2029 isn't a deadline either. It needs to be specific. How will you know you've achieved it? And I know we'll come on to this, Tim, in terms of setting measures for outcomes. As a human being, the only way you will know you've actually achieved something is what is actually measurably different. What will you see or hear or feel? Matthew Taylor, who these days is the chief executive of the NHS Confederations, when he was still chief executive of the RSA, did a series of talks about shaping change in a post-COVID world. And one of the things that he said, and I think he speaks with some authority, is that the vast majority of public policy and projects that we try to deliver in the public realm fail to achieve the outcomes that we thought that they would. And the main reason for it is because of our obsession with numbers. We think that changing numbers actually changes things in the real world, and often it doesn't. It's not that numbers aren't important, they're crucial, but numbers and targets and milestones should always be in service to the outcome we're actually trying to achieve. And the only way you'll know what that outcome is if you can describe what you'll see or hear or feel that will be different. And the last little bit, this last question then, how much of this is within your control? Because when you're delivering a project, most things in life, but certainly when you're delivering a project, and certainly in the public sector, the answer will often be not an awful lot. That you're tasked with delivering something, but there are so many stakeholders, so many various people involved, so many people whose control other bits are in. Some of it will be, there are some things that you can take action on, some of it won't. And defining that, making clear what bits you can do, what bits are in other people's control, and then what you can do about the bits that are in other people's control, who you can build relationships with, who you can have conversations with, helps to actually end up delivering the project. It's a really simple set of questions. And when you get your head around it, it's useful on a number of levels. And what senior leaders often say to us in terms of delivering change, it's useful for defining the overall outcome they're trying to achieve, the project, whatever it is they're trying to achieve. It's useful in keeping themselves sane. So having those questions for yourself, because you will meet bumps along the way. You will have things that are not in your control and you're being held accountable for. There will be firestorms. There'll be all sorts of things that happen. And having those questions in your head when they do, how is this a problem for me right now? What do I want to have happen if I could have it? Helps to keep yourself sane and reduces stress and anxiety. And the other way that the questions are often used quite a lot is in working with other people. In working with your team, for example, asking them those questions in order to ensure delivery happens. And also working with stakeholders before you walk into a room to have a conversation with them, working out, how is this a problem for them? Where's the pain for them? What's the outcome they want to achieve in this? And so on, and working through those questions to make those conversations more likely to be productive and effective.
Michael, just to pick up on what you just said, this checklist, is this something that you sort of revisit again during a program's lifetime, or is it something you only do at the start?
We do it continually, and one of the lovely things about the well-formed outcome, one of the things our seniors often say is it's good for all time zones. It's such a useful set of questions to have in your head. At the start, what the feedback we often get is, even if you only get your head around the first two questions, how is this a problem for me? And what would I rather have? In terms of your own well-being and resilience when you're dealing with the complexities of a project, it's really important. But having that set of questions is crucial in terms of leading projects and managing projects. I mentioned we often deal with a lot of our work is in the public sector, and public sectors the world over are quite similar. There are a lot of stakeholders involved. So in Northern Ireland, for example, you've got, when it's up and running, we've got the Assembly and an executive and a First and Deputy First Minister. We've got committees. We have the Northern Ireland Audit Office. We have the Public Accounts Committee. We have committees within the Assembly. You've got the civil service. You've got arm's length bodies. You've got the voluntary and community sector. You have public agencies who deliver projects as well. You also have politics and the political parties. And you've got people, and everything that happens in terms of public service affects an awful lot of people. So you have a lot of stakeholders involved in whatever you do. And I'm kind of reminded a conversation we had previously, Tim. Stafford Beer, one of the godfathers of systems thinking, used to say that the greatest challenge in leadership and in creating change is complexity. And the only way to deal with complexity is organisation. And one of the lovely things about that well-formed outcome checklist and the questions that John then developed, it's a great way to organise your thinking when you're dealing with this.
So a question's come in from Carsten about sustainability. He says on delivering sustainability, that's part of managing the benefits of a program, actively managing the benefits. And he says many big projects are politics driven when sustainability, what he understands as sustainability, comes second. Is that your experience too?
Again, I'm very conscious of stepping outside my lane, so I want to be very careful when I do this. It's something that a lot of people would talk about, a lot of senior leaders would talk about, and organisations would talk about too, because, and I suppose it's kind of what we were just talking about in terms of the various stakeholders involved. The reality in public services is you are dealing with politics, and a lot of the incentives in politics are short term, whereas the projects we want to deliver that actually make a difference in people's lives are often longer term. And there's a tension there. There's a lovely, it's a thing that you'll know well from NLP, Tim, called perceptual positions. And it's developed from the work of Fritz Perls, but John Grinder, Judy Deleuze, Robert Dilts developed it into something to think about. And the basic concept is that when you're trying to do anything with people, there are at least three perspectives. There's yours and what you're trying to do. There's the other persons, whether that's the person you're walking into a meeting with, the stakeholder, a politician, whoever it might be. And there's what someone from the outside would see. There's what an observer with no skin in the game whatsoever would see. And wisdom comes from having all three perspectives. And what's really, really useful when you're trying to deliver something that has multiple outcomes or multiple stakeholders involved is being able to work through a well-formed outcome from each of those perspectives. So if you're walking into a meeting and you think about, right, how is this a problem for me? What is it I want to achieve? Where and when do I want to have it? How would I know I've actually got it? What would I see, hear, feel? How much of it's within my control? And then put yourself in the shoes of the person you're walking into a meeting with, whether it's the politician, whether it's a stakeholder, whoever it would be. How is it a problem for them? Because not only will it get you where they're coming from in terms of the conversation, the meeting, but it also shows you where the pain point is for them. Mm-hmm. What is it they want to achieve? What's their outcome and so on, and working it through. And then taking a step back and as an observer, thinking about the interaction you would have. For example, the conversation about sustainability in the project. How is this a problem? What is it we want to achieve? And how do you make that conversation better? What are the things to pay attention to in terms of the conversation that needs to take place? And it's probably an ongoing one when it comes to sustainability.
Certainly, there's a lot of conversations, a lot of thinking to be done when you're applying this model to an outcome. Michael, for the time being, thank you. We're going to move on as time is pressing to the next step of this webinar, and that's our Mentimeter audience pulse. You in the audience to give us your views on how some of the things we talked about apply in your area. So that's very interesting. We don't have a lot of time to discuss the outputs, but Michael, just looking at that off the top, it looks as if what we found was that most people already have project outcomes that are stated positively, which is quite helpful. Kind of equal split about the outcomes are imposed by others, and I just deliver them. And then some people saying I've consulted about outcomes. Very few say I set the outcomes. The majority on outcomes, the specificity of the outcomes. So the majority of people said my outcomes are sometimes not specifically defined and can be confusing. That's an interesting finding, which I didn't expect. But close behind that was they're usually defined and measurable, but they can be interpreted differently. So there's some elements in there. Only 16 out of our respondees said they're always clearly defined and everybody understands them the same way. So, and then on resources, a very big majority said we try and get as many resources as we need. It's not within our control always. And then roughly similar on ecology, around about equal between ecology is considered in a wider context and adverse impacts are considered, and sometimes we adjust the outcome if it's going to mess something else up. So anyway, there's not a lot of time for us to talk about these, but anything that jumped out at you particularly?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and actually it's Northern Ireland, along with a lot of other public services, have moved to the outcomes-based accountability model. Basically because of that, because outcomes can be very big and can be interpreted. As you mentioned, what does world class mean? What does world beating mean? How would you actually begin to define that? And it can be really confusing, especially in a complex public service. So outcomes based accountability is based on the idea that if we do something, it should actually change something in the real world. And funnily enough, there's a lot of overlap between that and the concept of the well-formed outcome in NLP. And the three key questions you need to be able to answer are: how much did we do? How well did we do it? And is anyone better off? And you have to be able to define it in terms of what you see or hear or feel that's actually different. because it makes measuring outcomes so much easier than deciding what the right measures will be along the way. The other thing funny about outcomes being imposed, I don't know if it's helpful, but it's that little bit of what's within your control. The well-formed outcome can be really, really useful in terms of whoever's imposing the outcomes asking them those questions in order to define the outcome, because often they haven't thought it through. And also thinking for yourself in terms of defining, well, given what we've been given, how do we define the outcome? How do we measure it?
Okay, thank you, Michael, for that insight. Now we're really out of time now, but I just wanted to put on screen our details. So if you feel you'd like to know a bit more about anything we've covered today, or you need some help with applying any of this, then our contact details are on the screen, and we'll be in the recording and slides later. If you want to connect to us on LinkedIn, our details are there. Please mention that you saw us in this webinar, really, that's the end of the webinar. Thank you very much in the audience for joining us and for interacting with us in that way, and also the questions. We didn't really get a time to put a lot of those questions up. And then really, it's just to ask you for feedback. We'll pull stumps there. So thank you everybody who's involved today, and thank you to Kim who's had to leave.
Thanks very much. Thank you.